27th day, Upper Wind Month, 1 CE, 1 Beastman Lord, Tyra said, as requested. I'd call it an abduction, but we never left his place. Ludmilla glanced at the Gao Lord, who was glaring at them from where he was chained and bound to a column in Feligia's central keep. Unlike the great halls in the cities of Riestais and Baharuth, those of the Draconic Kingdom did not belong to any presiding lord. Instead, every city belonged to the Queen, and every keep was one of her seats of power. Thanks, Tyra, she offered the intelligence officer a lopsided smile. They disintegrated faster than expected. I don't think it was much of a surprise, Tyra replied. Most of the beastmen came in from elsewhere. They never put down their roots here. Once we shook 'em up, they decided that moving on was a better idea. Did you get the chieftains that ran? We did. It would have been much harder to find them if you hadn't identified them in advance. Now that the undead horde was moving on to what their reconnaissance forces had identified as the far more organized provinces of the Beastman occupation, the need for in-depth information grew more urgent. They had, of course, been capturing and interrogating various beastmen fleeing from the royal army's advance since their arrival in Orichalon, but they were all mysteriously ignorant of the bigger picture. According to them, they had come from the Beastman country in the east, following the Orichalon River downstream. They continued until they reached Rivergarden, where they were issued instructions to head northwest. It was as if they were common folk migrating to build a new life in a new land, and she supposed that that was precisely what they were. Have anything for us now that we're done here? Tyra asked. You can start preparing for Phase 2, Ludmilla answered. The army is reorganizing to form the new front and we'll be seeing how the beastmen react to the news of our advance. There should be about a week to do what you need to do. Also, when the Queen's entourage arrives in Feligia, you'll need to consult with Baroness Garnier about Phase 3. Gotcha. Tyra wandered off with a casual wave. Ludmilla left the Gao Lord with the Elder Lich watching over it, exiting the throne room to take a look at the freshly liberated city. It was dawn, but the sunrise was concealed by heavy grey clouds inundating the city rooftops with rain. The unfamiliar, shifting weather was something that the general staff hadn't accounted for, and she had a sense that it would heavily influence how they proceeded as spring progressed. As she continued gazing over the cityscape atop the keep's battlements, a pair of familiar figures approached. Baroness Zaradnik. She turned and smiled down at Liam and Say. Both she and her brother had grown by half a head since she first met them in Facet County, and their condition was much improved from their time in its impoverished capital. The young bard held out a hand, revealing the glittering band in her palm. Here's your ring back. Thank you, Say, Ludmilla said. Did anything happen when you took it off? It was something Ludmilla hadn't experienced. She was wearing a ring of sustenance when she died in the Azalizia Mountains, and she had attributed her lack of hunger and fatigue to the ring when it was in reality her newly undead state. I don't think so, my lady, Say replied. I ate and slept just before I took it off, so maybe that's why it felt like nothing changed. I see. And you, Liam, I hear you've become an assassin. Liam nodded. That's what they say, he said. I don't feel any different from before, though. Unless you gain a completely new skill, ability or spell, Ludmilla said, it's hard to notice as the person doing the growing. So it's like that for you, too? It is, Ludmilla replied, but it's not hard to keep track of if you prepare some ways to measure the changes happening to you. Ludmilla produced a meter-long steel bar from her infinite haversack, holding it out horizontally in front of her with one hand. She grasped the other end with her free hand and twisted it into a loop. Liam and Say gaped silently at the result. Something like that, Ludmilla said. The important part is that you use something that can offer a definitive measure of your growth. Some vocations have simpler ways to figure out whether one has advanced, but everyone has some way of checking. She dropped the steel bar into Liam's hands. The young assassin strained to unbend the metal, but it didn't budge in the slightest. Well, Ludmilla said, are you two ready for your next job? The two orphans turned intelligence agent trainees nodded. Their next job was the aforementioned Phase 2 of the Sorceress Kingdom's intelligence operations, which involved infiltrating the human populations behind the enemy lines in the east. To do that properly, however, they needed to be able to blend in with the locals. Say's really good at this stuff, Liam said. We'll be okay. You shouldn't make baseless statements, Liam, Ludmilla said. Say may be apt at this type of work, but you also have no idea what you're heading into. It's impossible to make a reasonable assessment in this situation. But you're sending us there, right? Just because I did doesn't mean that everything will go flawlessly. Our country is still establishing its essential institutions, and there are bound to be problems along the way. When it comes to raw strength, the Sorceress Kingdom is thus far unmatched, but we have plenty of other issues to address. Simply saying so was a colossal understatement. After Lady Shiltir formally convened her court, Ludmilla started to learn just how much work her friends had been putting into transitioning the Sorceress Kingdom smoothly from all of its disparate old elements. In many cases, there wasn't even an old element to transition from. Everything her friends were doing was far more complex than the straightforward progress she had achieved in her domain. Florine, especially, had put in a monumental effort. She had barely received any recognition from the population of Randall because her work wasn't with humans at all, it was with the millions of non-humans beyond the duchy's borders that had become subjects of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. The laws of their country had been arbitrarily imposed upon them, and Florine frantically worked to untangle the chaos that ensued. Her trading posts dotting the great forest of Tob, the Azalisian foothills and the Azalisia mountains were only the tip of the iceberg, as the frost giants were wont to say. After Liam and Say left to study the population of the city, Ludmilla called down Raoul, who was loitering high above on a skeletal dragon. The undead construct landed atop the keep, and the captured Beastman Lord was brought up to be taken away for interrogation. "I'll be heading to Blighthold to deliver my report to Queen Auriculus," she told Raoul. "Can you handle the transfer of the prisoner?" "Yes, Captain," Raoul replied. "Should I join you after that?" "Keep an eye on the front for now," Ludmilla said. "The activity along the front is likely to change, and we won't be as responsive to new developments as I'd like. Make sure you stick to high-altitude observation. If they notice you, it might ruin everything." The Gowlord let out a distressed yelp as the skeletal dragon grabbed it firmly in both foreclaws. Raoul took off and headed south with an escort of 4 elder liches. With her business in the city concluded, Ludmilla activated her hairpin and flew to the northwest. Following the liberation of Helama, the royal army repositioned itself to surround Fallujah. The Beastman occupation fell apart within a day of the intelligence division's arrival, however, so now the army was awkwardly trying to form a proper front for the next stage of their operation. Given how much ground the K9 Beastmen fleeing their advance could cover, they would probably start seeing a reaction to the West's fall within the next day or two. Ludmilla alighted on the road across the river from Fallujah, picking up speed as she skipped over the ground with her flight enchantment still in effect. She returned the salute of the Death Series servitors as she skimmed over the vanguard of the undead horde. It took her just under 3 hours to reach the Selan estuary, and her flight over the river mouth landed her atop Blighthold's southern gatehouse. Concealed as she was, no one noted her arrival. She made her way over the rooftops, partially out of curiosity over what it was like to move around like a ninja, and then dropped down into an alley near the city's central plaza. With the arrival of Queen Auriculus, all of Blighthold City was in a festive mood, but she ignored the colorful and animated goings-on as she made her way to the city hall. Now that the building had been cleaned up and redecorated, Ludmilla realized it was a palatial office not dissimilar in function to Randall's royal villa. Upon her entry, a noble woman in a light outfit of mint silks looked up from behind the front reception. She visibly swallowed as Ludmilla approached. "Baroness Saradnik," the noble woman said, "we weren't aware that you would be in the city." "I've arrived to deliver a report to Her Majesty," Ludmilla replied. "If Her Majesty is unavailable, then Marshal Zulu will suffice." "Her Majesty has already departed on her tour of the countryside," the noble woman replied. "His Excellency the Marshal is accompanying her." Ludmilla calmly waited for her to continue, but she simply stared back. A few heartbeats later, the noble woman started to tremble. "What part of the province is she visiting today?" Ludmilla prompted. They're on their way northeast up the river at the moment." "Thank you. Have a good afternoon." She left the office and departed the city. Her friends had been complaining about how uncooperative the Draconic Kingdom's courtiers had become, but the way that they interacted with Ludmilla made them seem more airheaded than anything else. From above, the area around the city looked abuzz with activity. With the removal of the Beastmen and the makeshift administration implementing the royal court's directives, the surviving citizens were reorganizing and moving to occupy lands made vacant by predation. It wasn't hard to spot where the queen was, as a large train of wagons and soldiers formed her entourage several kilometers away from the city. The first to notice her approach was, of course, Lord Tian, who looked over his shoulder straight at her from 200 meters away. I was concealed, too. Well, it's not as if the sky has much cover. Lack of cover aside, her equipment was still supposed to raise her concealment ability by a substantial amount. Not long after she had received her equipment, Lady Aura noted that Ludmilla had about the same stealth as an unequipped ranger in their high 30s while she had her mantle on. She had become stronger since then, so that had likely gone up accordingly. Ludmilla had become so accustomed to being nearly undetectable to everything that it felt a bit odd to be noticed when she didn't want to be. This was especially true when flying around, as very few beings paid attention to what was going on above them. On the bright side, it meant that not very many individuals could get close to Queen Auriculus without the royal butler noticing. Out of habit, Ludmilla circled the village where the queen was holding court with her subjects to check the surroundings before landing on the road leading to it. The first person to notice her aside from Sabos was a ranger that she recognized from the Highfort garrison, who did so at about 20 meters. Captain Zaradnik, he nodded. Captain Insera's in charge of the security detail. He's just ahead at the edge of the village square. Thank you, Ludmilla replied with a smile. The man knew who she had to see and directed her straight to him without prompting. Was it so difficult that a highly educated noblewoman couldn't do the same? Queen Auriculus was in the center of the village square, her innocent young queen mode in full swing. Ludmilla idly wondered what would happen if she acted as cutesy as the queen did. The citizens of the Draconic Kingdom seemed to receive their queen's pseudo-childlike behavior well. While Ludmilla's subjects also received their baroness well, she wasn't sure if she could stomach the sheer intensity of the attention lavished upon the Draconic Kingdom's sovereign. Not that she thought she could pull it off. Captain Insera. Oh, Captain Zaradnik. Did something happen? I'm here to deliver a report, but it can wait until she's done holding court. The villagers looked so pleased that she wouldn't be surprised if they attacked her if she interrupted the proceedings. How are things going in the province so far? She asked. No problems on our end, Captain Insera answered. I doubt there'd be any issues so long as the nobles are around to keep things organized. Once everything's set up, it should be pretty quiet until the harvest. You seem absolutely certain about that. How do I put it? Captain Insera drummed his fingers against the helm in the crook of his arm. This is something like the best part of life here. When the beastmen come raiding, it's the time right after that's the safest. People spread out to their new lands and life's got that green feeling to it. Like you got a future filled with potential ahead of you. I suppose I can see how you can see it that way, Ludmilla said. Raiding is cyclical, so it becomes akin to seasons. Yeah, like that. If being raided is winter, then the time following that is spring. Once a part of the border is attacked, we get years to grow again while the beastmen target other territories. Though they were often included in the same broad sphere as the rest of the human countries in the region, the people of the Draconic Kingdom had drastic differences in their mindset and lifestyle. While places such as Riastais and Baharuth saw raids as an absolute negative and did everything that they could afford to stop them, the Draconic Kingdom had little choice but to account for them politically, economically and culturally. Being raided was a form of performance benchmarking, if one were to use the terminology of the Sorceress Kingdom's elder Lich administrators. It was an unbiased assessment of the progress achieved since the previous assessment. Since the raids tended to leave infrastructure intact, the Draconic Kingdom always bounced back with few domestic issues and could thus continue refining what they had. Many aspects of the Draconic Kingdom were likely far more advanced than the other countries in the region due to their unique situation. People from those other countries just had difficulty seeing it because they were raised on an entirely different paradigm, one that was in reality built on completely false foundations. The Draconic Kingdom had one false cornerstone of its own, which was the fact that the theocracy turned away raids that the Draconic Kingdom was incapable of dealing with. Even so, that assistance always came after those raids demonstrated what was lacking, so it wasn't the same as what the theocracy had been doing in the north. At least that was the case until the most recent invasion, which she still had absolutely no reasonable explanation for. It was a good thing that the Sorceress Kingdom was around to make up for the shortfall. Queen Auriculus finished holding court 15 minutes later. Ludmilla lowered her head in a curtsy as the Queen and her entourage made their way back towards their carriages. Baroness Saradnik, Queen Auriculus inclined her head slightly. We are surprised to see you here. Did you not say you would be overseeing the liberation of Fallujah? Plans rarely go completely according to one's calculations, Your Majesty, Ludmilla replied. Fallujah has been liberated 2 days ahead of schedule. The elated voices that rose in response to her statement were somewhat tempered. Fallujah being liberated was good news, but it also meant that another province was waiting for administrators to oversee its recovery. The nobles of the Draconic Kingdom had barely started with Blighthold, and there were still more provinces to go through before they got around to Fallujah. Again, we cannot begin to express our most heartfelt thanks for your work, Queen Auriculus said. We assume there are some matters to discuss? Otherwise, the update would have been delivered through Countess Corlin. Yes, Your Majesty. Several sundry matters require your approval. We should also review the strategic situation going forward. Let's do that on the way to the next village. Yorston, Zulu, attend. Amidst the cheerful farewell of the villagers, Prime Minister Ina Yorston and Marshal Amod Zulu stepped into the carriage with Queen Auriculus and Lord Tian. A footman closed the door behind Ludmilla after she seated herself beside the Marshal and across from the Queen. So, she said. What do you have for us, Lady Zaradnik? First is the matter of Lakefall. Ludmilla started with the fortress guarding the pass above Fallujah. We've cleared out the Beastmen occupants and request Your Majesty's permission to assume control of the area. Meaning there were no survivors? Regrettably not, Your Majesty, Ludmilla shook her head. The traces of conflict are even older than the fortresses preceding it, so I suspect that the trend will continue. Queen Auriculus released a small sigh. Her lips formed into a shape, but she still had the sense of one resolutely facing adversity. Your forces have our permission to assume command of Lakefall, she said. How are the people of Fallujah doing? The depopulation of the city and its province is increasingly severe the further east one gets. Reconnaissance suggests that over 70% of the population has been lost overall. Leather creaked as Marshal Zulu clenched a fist over his knee beside her. On the bright side, Ludmilla added, this should be the worst of what remains, Your Majesty. Are you sure that report was accurate? After the reports of what happened in the north, we fear to hope it is the case. It was, Ludmilla replied. Furthermore, we regularly update our information and things have remained stable since we started monitoring the provinces along the eastern front. While losing 50% of the eastern population was still significant, it was far better than losing over 95%, as had happened in the provinces just west of River Garden. As long as they could free the rest of the country with the same degree of efficiency as they had so far, the Draconic Kingdom would be well on its way to a robust recovery. You mentioned that there will be a shift in strategy, Marshal Zulu said. Yes, Your Excellency, Ludmilla nodded. The drastic differences in management between the eastern portions of the country and what we've recovered so far merit caution. We need to gauge their reaction to our advance to see whether the methods we've been using can still be employed. How could they not be? Marshal Zulu said, your forces are practically unstoppable. The only reason why the Beastmen haven't been wiped out is due to our desire to minimize collateral damage. Which is a desire that remains unchanged, Ludmilla said. What has changed is what we face. We've relied heavily on chaos, confusion and ignorance amongst the Beastmen thus far, and the nature of our opponents in the east suggests that they may not be as susceptible to our tactics. Marshal Zulu's dark-eyed gaze went to Queen Auriculus. The Queen pursed her lips, as if pondering her options. If our subjects were under immediate threat, we would urge you to free them as quickly as possible. But that isn't the case, is it? No, Your Majesty, Ludmilla replied. And our administration has a weeks-long backlog as it is, the Queen continued. Your previous report said that our captive subjects are simply tending to their lands as they normally would, yes? Ludmilla nodded. Then we do not see a problem with waiting for a while to see how the Beastmen respond. Whether they are returned to the fold or remain under the Beastmen, they would be doing the same thing until the administration catches up. Is there anything that we missed? Prime Minister Yorston and Marshal Zulu shook their heads. Queen Auriculus nodded quietly. We understand that the people would consider it a relief to be under our rule again, but their safety comes first and foremost. What is the next item on the table for discussion, Lady Zaradnik? Next, would be how we should approach Forcha Bay. The way we execute the southern offensive will depend on that. Do you have any information on how things are going there? Not since we arrived, Your Majesty. It was under siege much like the cities in the north. The southern provinces will be harder to handle than the riverlands. They're always the last to be cleared out whenever the theocracy sends its forces. If the people there are facing the same situation as the western provinces, however, it would be best to relieve them as quickly as possible. In that case, I'll arrange for a transfer of personnel while we develop a better picture of the area. A transfer of personnel? Yes, Your Majesty. The undead forces currently under my command have undergone training in terrain similar to your riverlands. We can leave them on the main front while I bring in squads from my territory that are accustomed to operating in terrain similar to your southern provinces. One must wonder whether legendary, country-destroying undead require such training at all. That's probably a common question, Ludmilla smirked. The answer is yes, though. As with any other intelligent being, they must learn how to function optimally within any given environment. Since Death Series servitors are fundamentally soldiers of different types, they have the same benefits and detriments as their living counterparts. Except for the fact that they never tire, never break and are worth an army on their own. Yes, Your Majesty. It was probably better to leave the details to a proper briefing. The fact of the matter was that Death Series servitors performed poorly in terrain unsuited to them. They didn't have any abilities that helped out with it and thus had a hard time getting around. Zombies and squire zombies were already slow and clumsy and it was impossible to fight any sort of running battle with them. Differences in elevation and plentiful cover gave stealthy, ranged combatants a significant advantage. Overall, they might be facing a headache if they found themselves fighting Beastman Rangers. At least they didn't have gnolls to contend with. Ludmilla went through a few more bits of business before they arrived at the next town. After the Queen and her entourage went ahead to do their thing, Clara came along and playfully bumped her hip against hers. You didn't even say hi to me, she pouted. Hi. Clara rolled her amethyst eyes. I don't see Leanne and Florine, Ludmilla said. They stayed back in Blighthold to do their own thing, Clara told her. Meanwhile, Her Majesty's court stuck me and Tyre in a carriage by our lonesome. She glanced at Clara's lady's maid. Has Clara been behaving herself? She asked. For the most part, my lady, Tyre replied. Wah. When since did you work for Ludmilla? Bits of the old you are coming out, so I felt it prudent. They're not coming out. Getting ignored constantly is just annoying. Ludmilla took Clara by the hand, leading her away from the clamor of the village. Clara immediately stuck herself onto her after they went around the broad trunk of a laurel tree at the village boundary. Ludmilla smiled to herself as she idly stroked the silky strands of golden hair under her fingers. They're ignoring you? Not any more than before. Clara rested her head against Ludmilla's shoulder. It's more that the Queen's court is getting swept up in their duties. They have mountains of work and they're woefully understaffed. So, no time for the foreign delegate. Since we're here to help them recover, Clara said. I can hardly interfere and they make all of their decisions behind closed doors. That part needed to change. Making inroads, building trust and broadly collaborating with the Draconic Kingdom on multiple levels was crucial to their long-term diplomatic efforts. In that case, Ludmilla said, you should have plenty of time to plot and scheme. I can plot and scheme just fine either way, Clara replied. Honestly, I'd rather be with Leanne and Florine since they get to do all of the fun things. As the head of the delegation, however, I need to stay with the Queen. What are they doing in Blighthold, anyway? Whenever you bring up fun, it makes me want to run into a forest and hide. Oh, setting up the new exclave, investigating the markets, briefing our merchants, and hatching our plots and schemes. Nothing personal, Leanne said. It's just business. Silence filled the main hall of the Blighthold Merchant Guild. The space was recently used as an inner-city shelter, but the men and women gathered before her were oblivious to its lingering odors following Leanne's statement. It sounded like a threat to me. What's the point in that? Leanne replied with a laugh, it's time to face the facts. The beastmen ran off with your gold reserves. Your country has a massive trade deficit. Your industrial production isn't going to be able to make up for it anytime soon. You guys might have escaped being gobbled up by the beastmen, but that ain't gonna save you from being gobbled up by us. Low murmurs rose from the crowd, but they didn't last long. The Beastman occupation and its consequences were easy enough to understand. But the Queen will. A young man with dark brown hair started to speak, and then his voice stilled. The other merchants standing around him sighed. Usually, when a part of the Draconic Kingdom was raided, the Queen pooled her country's resources to support their recovery. Now, however, the entire country was in the same situation or worse. The only thing they could do was try and claw themselves out of the hole they had found themselves in. An older woman in the front row cleared her throat. The administration said that as long as we carry on as we did before, we'll be fine. Well, what the administration thinks is fine probably won't be fine for you guys. Still, the woman said, they won't ruin the country. She likely wasn't wrong. The royal court of the Draconic Kingdom, or more accurately, the landlords of the Draconic Kingdom and their tenants, understood that the Sorceress Kingdom's Death Series servitors would provide them with all the time in the world to rebuild. With that in mind, they embarked on a traditionalist approach, relying on their primary industries to fuel their country's recovery. This was all well and good so long as one had land to work with or worked in the industries that supported them. In the wake of the Beastman occupation, that was almost everyone in the Draconic Kingdom, which effectively gave the royal court unlimited political will. It was strange, in a way. Detrimental events usually had the effect of eroding the power of the establishment as public sentiment for those in power turned sour and competition for resources grew. In the Draconic Kingdom, calamity only made the establishment stronger as the entire country rallied around the crown to bounce back. Other human rulers in the region could only sigh and wish that they had even a third of Queen Auricula's power over her country's domestic affairs. There was one group, however, that had no land and could still influence the Draconic Kingdom's economic landscape. It was that group that Leanne and her friends now turned to undermine the impossible wall that was Queen Auricula's court. The Draconic Kingdom's nobility wasn't stupid and already recognized them as an opponent, but that only played into the Sorceress Kingdom's hands. Not on purpose, maybe, Leanne said. But from where I stand, things are looking grim for y'all. You know your nobles better than me, so I won't bother telling you what they're like. Blighthold's new guildmaster, a middle-aged man she had met before in Oraculon, crossed his arms. Then what's your angle? He asked. Doesn't seem like you stand to gain anything by telling us this. A friendly warning? Leanne tilted her head. We're supposed to be helping you guys out, after all. Also, our companies are expanding like crazy, so it'd be great if you join us on good terms. We're not finished yet. A voice rose from the back. Don't just go and kill us off. Feel free to struggle all you like, Leanne said. I won't hold it against you when you finally come crawling to us. With her provocation delivered, Leanne left the Blighthold Merchant Guild. Florine let out a sigh after several blocks. You didn't have to be so mean, she said. It'll stick better that way, Leanne replied. I can't do the crazy things you do, after all. They're not crazy. Look, Leanne said, if a girl like you walks into a cave full of hungry trolls that she's never met before and leaves with a cave full of best buddies, that's crazy. No one will say that it isn't. It isn't as if I beat them up. If you did, then at least it'd be understandable. Magical boob powers are not. Florine's hand shot out and pinched Leanne's wrist. Leanne let out a yelp. They're not magical boob powers, Florine seethed. Clara can do it too, you know. She could, but the effect was different. Clara was cool and distant, like a piece of art to admire from afar. Florine was warm and fluffy, and people couldn't help but want to grow closer to her. Clara isn't lewd, though. I'm not lewd, either. Yaha. Deny it all you want, but that's just how it is. I bet that thingy Lady Schultier gave you will turn you into something lewd, too. It'll be like your true form. By the way, did it change any yet? No, Florine frowned. It hasn't changed one bit since I activated it. I don't get what I'm supposed to do. Maybe you don't need to do anything, Leanne said. It could be calibrating to you or just working overtime. Maybe it'll add stuff in bits and pieces. Like a third tit. You're going to make me throw this thing into the sea, Florine said. So far, it didn't look like Florine had any idea what was required to activate the race change item, or else she would have already thrown it into the sea. Leanne had already suggested that her friend do certain things that might lead to claiming souls, but Florian was too conscious of inadvertently harming others, and everything Leanne came up with was rejected. Why am I in such a rush, anyway? Florian never even mentions it without me asking. She gave her best friend a sidelong glance. Deep in her heart, Leanne understood that the problem lay with herself. The Sorceress Kingdom tested its people in various ways, and many of their methods could be cruel or extreme. They wanted to see if they could transform Florian in a roundabout way, and they wanted to see how far Leanne would go for her sake. For her part, Leanne was perfectly fine with doing whatever was required, but a sense of foreboding haunted her along the way. What if they failed? What if Lady Schulte ran out of patience waiting for results? What if Florian found out what the item actually required? She might not throw it into the sea, but Leanne still had no doubt in her mind that Florian would refuse to go through with the transformation if she knew what was going on. Leanne? If that happened, everything would all fall apart. They would lose what they had together. That absolutely couldn't happen. Leanne. Huh? What? You walked right by it. Leanne looked over her shoulder. They were making their way along Blighthold's wharf. Behind them was a cordoned-off section that took up two of its piers. Is this gonna be enough? She frowned at the sight. It looks kinda puny now that we're here in person. We all agreed that it's sufficient, Florian said. A berth with enough room for the necessary equipment and space for a few dozen containers. You always try to add stuff to everything after the fact. It just feels weird to look at, you know? Usually, you'd have a bunch of cargo lots and warehouses too. Even though they were the ones pioneering the new cargo system, they had still grown up having old logistical realities drilled into them. It would take a while to get used to things. Several members of the Sorceress Kingdom's royal court occasionally pointed out one oversight or another that seemed obvious in hindsight. The main warehouse for their operations in the Draconic Kingdom was not in the Draconic Kingdom at all, but in Lagos. Transportation had become so efficient and modular that they could deliver goods anywhere on the coast within about a day. All that they really needed at each city was space for compatible port facilities and a small office to process deliveries. Everything else was merely a luxury that would be nice if they could get away with it, which they didn't in the end. A cargo barge was moored in a port and members of the exclave staff were working to unload containers onto the rocky pier. The human members of the staff had already been ferried over from Corlin Harbor by Ruin's Wake. A construction team was also present and puzzling out how to turn the waterfront into a respectable-looking trade complex. They only had about 200 square meters to work with, which annoyed Leanne to no end. That transfer station must be taking up a third of the space, she muttered. We wouldn't need it at all if they'd just use our stuff. I think it's fine for now, Florian said. The construction crews need to learn how to best build them anyway. This won't be the only place where they'll be necessary. The Draconic Kingdom's royal court was still rejecting undead labor, which also meant that they wouldn't be improving their infrastructure to support the Sorceress Kingdom's cargo container system. Fortunately, Lord Demiurge's half-sized containers could still be used so long as wagons that could handle them were employed. I guess we should split up now, Leanne said. I'll be over there pestering the company staff. MHM. Leanne left Florian standing near the exclave entrance. Now that they had left their warning with the Blighthold Merchant Guild, all they had to do was wait for some of the more proactive members to come searching for a solution to their predicament. It wasn't a difficult solution, plus it was stupidly obvious, but the cultural gap between nobles and merchants that existed in other countries was also present in the Draconic Kingdom. They, or at least she and Clara, had been blind to what that cultural gap could mean, but this was no longer the case. Once they had the chance, they would have to rework their strategy in the Baharuth Empire, as well. The first of the factional representatives would be arriving in the summer, so it was a good thing that they were made aware of the issue before that. She wandered over to the side of the exclave boundary, where a half-dozen men and women were assembling one of her newer wagon models. Drum up any interest yet? They looked up at the sound of her voice, then turned their attention back to their work. Not yet, milady, the lead mechanic said. The locals still don't know we exist. That'll change once things get going here, Leanne said. Did you figure out what sort of demonstration you'll give yet? Should be the standard, the man replied. Actually, it's weird, I'm pretty sure these guys are ahead of where we were back before everything happened. Did you notice that? Sure did, Lian nodded. It wasn't just the fact that the Draconic Kingdom was broadly more advanced than Riestais or the Empire, but also the fact that that advancement was seamlessly integrated into its economy, governance and culture. In the north, a farmer was pretty much ignorant of what was going on beyond their village, and the difference between a rural village and a city was stark. The Draconic Kingdom, however, was extraordinarily well connected and universally well developed. The only aspects where the Draconic Kingdom tended to fall short were in areas where veterancy was crucial. High-tier magic casters and a well-developed military were two such examples. The strongest were generally eaten first, so those who had advanced significantly in their vocation tended to not have a chance to pass on their expertise to the next generation. How do you think that happened? These guys are constantly under attack by the beastmen next door, aren't they? That's probably exactly how it happened, Lian said. It's just like how competition keeps us sharp. In their case, they have to squeeze every bit of performance out of what they have. The people here must be made different. The man shook his head. You get a little raid in the north and the people drop everything to go screaming for imperial knights or adventurers. Here, they lose more than half their people and just keep going. The wagon frame was assembled and the bed was installed within 10 minutes. It was rolled over to the transfer station, where a half-sized cargo container was loaded atop it. A Death Knight came out to test the vehicle, pulling it back and forth in front of the exclave. Looks like we're good here, the lead mechanic said. How many do you think we should assemble? We don't have much room to work with. You're teaching them how to assemble their own wagons and replace parts, right? Yeah. Then a half-dozen assembled wagons to show off should be more than enough. One of the big draws is how easy they are to put together and service, anyway. House Wagner's vehicle frames were one of the things that Lian was confident would sell well in the Draconic Kingdom regardless of what obstacles faced them in the royal court. Steel frames were lighter than wooden ones, and advances in her machining industry made interchangeable parts possible. They were stronger, easier to handle, a breeze to repair and cheaper than conventional wood or iron vehicle frames, so there was rationally no reason to turn them down in favor of anything short of a ship. Lian, they're here. Gonier's under attack. I'll check in on you guys later. Sure thing, milady. Lian went between a set of cargo containers before activating her invisibility item. Then she hurried over to the exclave entrance where Florine was pretending to read a book. Upon closer inspection, she was editing the upcoming volume of Dreams of Red. She's not going to release that series all at once here, is she? The entire country's productivity is going to collapse. Several sets of individuals were eyeing Florine across the way. Lian couldn't be sure which companies had sent them, but that part didn't matter. They just gonna stare at you all day? You're not even their type. More groups keep appearing. I hope they don't all come for me at once. There's probably a pecking order of some sort. As far as merchants went, the ones in the Draconic Kingdom were fairly tame. They tended to value collective prosperity over personal profit, which was likely a product of their country's situation. Every part of the country was attacked by beastmen eventually, and the guilds counteracted that by ensuring that industries and commerce quickly revived after the fact. This meant that they were compliant with the government, or at least the Queen, and weren't prone to straying too far from the country's objectives. Probably the best way to put it was that commercial competition was in service to a greater goal, which was tied to the well-being of the nation as a whole. The types of destructive interference between rivals that might be common in Baharuth and Riestais were dealt with severely in the Draconic Kingdom. Eventually, a dark-haired man in a tan fisher's jacket detached himself from one of the groups and approached the exclave. He went up and down the street 3 times, cautiously eyeing the goings-on within. On the 4th pass, Florine stopped him with a smile. "Is there something I might be able to help you with?" she asked. You're Baroness Gonnier? That's me. Countess Wagner isn't with you? We parted ways a little while ago. The man's head turned as he scanned the exclave, as if to confirm Florine's statement. I see, he visibly relaxed. My master sent me to invite you to his residence for lunch. He would like to discuss what might be done about the present situation. It would be a... Hold on a minute. Another man came storming across the street. You can't just run off with her like that. The Antalya group should take precedence among. Just because you're big doesn't mean you have any more right than we do to. More company representatives streamed over to state their claim to Florian's attention. The Baroness of Gonnier held her hands up in front of her, leaning back from their heated argument. "There's more than I expected. Shouldn't this be like all of them? Maybe? I can't see past the front row." The tread of metal sabatons shook the boardwalk as a Death Knight stomped over in response to the rising commotion. Gazes turned up in deathly silence as it came to stand behind Florian. "I'm all right," she smiled up at the undead servitor, then turned her attention back to the crowd. "Now, I can't exactly go and have lunch with 30 different parties, but I can entertain your queries in the office here. The building isn't furnished yet, so there should be plenty of standing room for everyone." With their choice between accepting her proposal or risking another fruitless deadlock, the agents dispersed to retrieve their masters. Florian went with Rose and Tia to the office to see what could be done about hospitality, which wasn't much. Merchants started to appear 15 minutes later, sporting hooded mantles as if they were on their way to some clandestine meeting. Leanne smiled to herself as she watched them collect in the office through one of the windows. "Muahaha, they're in the Sorceress Kingdom now. We can do whatever we want to 'em." "Hush, you." Florian looked over the gathering from her place partway up the office stairwell. "I don't suppose this means you plan on selling your companies to us?" "It doesn't," Leto Antalya, head of the Antalya Group, said. "We'd like to know what's really going on. The directives from the royal court and our dealings with your merchants so far don't add up." "How so?" "The targets issued for our country's industrial efforts are to be expected in a situation like this," the red-haired man said. "But the prices of commodities being shipped to us from your kingdom are queer. The guild officials from Oraculon said that the Sorceress Kingdom had some sort of special arrangement with the court, but the way things are set up right now, everyone's basically been told to try and compete with your cheapest exports." "I believe that accurately sums up the situation as far as your end of things is concerned," Florian said. "But that doesn't make any sense." "It doesn't," Florian agreed. "But we are not here to dictate policy to your royal court. We will, however, extend our economic reach into your country. I'm certain you understand that there is no malice involved, it is simply good business conducted within the bounds of Merchant Guild regulations." Leto Antalya crossed his arms, twisting his lip as he stared at the ground. "That puts us in a hard spot," he said. "We've always supported the court's directives after raids and other major incidents. For the good of our country." "Which I find very respectable," Florian said. "But, as merchants, you have already sensed that something is amiss. At this point, you should be asking yourselves whether you are truly acting for the good of your country." Florian produced a clipboard from her infinite haversack, holding it out to the row of merchants at the bottom of the stairwell. One reached out to take it from her. Heads leaned in as those nearby examined what was written upon it. "This is the past 2 seasons' worth of commodities reports from the Erantal Merchant Guild," Florian told them. "Just like Mr. Antalya, you have all probably caught on to bits and pieces of the information here from your interactions with our merchants over the past couple of weeks." "I don't understand." The man holding the clipboard looked up at Florian. "If these are regular prices in Erantal, then why did the royal court issue those directives? Every industry has been instructed to focus on producing basic commodities, but it would be much cheaper if we simply import them. Our trade deficit would be next to non-existent if we simply switched to these more valuable crops." In response, Florian shrugged slightly. "We are not privy to the deliberations of Her Majesty's royal court. The Sorceress Kingdom only stands to gain if things continue as they are, so I'm sure you understand that we are not bringing this to your awareness for our material benefit." "The Queen's court is full of young scions," Leto Antalya stroked his jaw. "In lieu of any court experience, they could just be trying to imitate what their predecessors did." "It's pride," someone asserted. "They're trying to preserve our country's economic independence. But these prices, what they're doing is hamstringing us instead." "I agree. Our recovery would be much smoother if we didn't cling to some notion of resource security. Foreign trade has been so dismal until now. This is the opportunity that we wished we always had." Excited discussion filled the unfurnished office. "But the directives of the royal court are issued by the will of our queen," someone said. "Her Majesty wouldn't just let the nobility do this for no reason." The office quieted again. "Wow, that killed their enthusiasm quick. Did the administration supply you with any rationale for their directives?" Florian asked. No, a man in the front said, we're just used to facilitating them. It's always worked out before. I doubt those damn nobles would give us a reason even if we asked, someone grumbled. Ultimately, Florian said, you must decide where your loyalties lie. In the grand scheme of things, a merchant's role is to facilitate an efficient market. Profits arise from identifying and exploiting inefficiencies in the market. Competition for profits corrects those inefficiencies. Can you truly say that you are serving your queen and country if you allow those inefficiencies to be one-sidedly leveraged against the Draconic Kingdom? It is the merchants, not the nobles, that serve on the front lines of this battle. It may be as you say, the man said, but merchants are only merchants in the Draconic Kingdom. We don't have any land or power beyond company assets. The people listen to the nobles because they're their landlords and they represent the queen. Our country's industries won't produce different goods simply because we merchants say that something else is a better idea. Those nobles probably couldn't tell a field of millet from a field of flax. You idiot, we can't go and have the people plant crops behind their backs. I'm not suggesting that anyone does anything illegal, Florian said. Merchants have many methods to achieve the results that they desire, yes? The reason why we brought this to your attention is because the flow of information between merchant guild branches is still frozen and, as merchants, you cannot make the correct choices without it. Once lines of communication are re-established, you would have identified the problem on your own. And, if they ignored the problem, it would hurt. Not only would the Sorceress Kingdom's merchants be undercutting the Draconic Kingdom on staples like food and timber, but they would also be snapping up the commodities that sold for a higher price in Nerantal. The people of the Draconic Kingdom would be running around naked by winter or dry season or whatever they called it. I'll see what the nobles have to say about this first, Leto Antalya said. If they provide an unsatisfactory answer, well, I'll do what I can. Murmurs of agreement rose from the gathering. Leanne left the window once the merchants started to vacate the office. Hopefully, they had shaken them up enough to see some results. And if they don't act, then I guess we're cleaning them out. Leanne was struck from behind. She fell forward onto the ground. As she lay sprawled on her face, the world was filled with noise and something heavy rolled right up her back. And then another something. What was that? Ah, that's one of the newest vehicle frames from House Wagner's workshops. The Sorceress Kingdom has a cargo system that I think everyone here would be most interested in. I meant the strange noise. Strange noise? Florian leaned out to look at the road. That's... Leanne, what are you doing? Nothing. We're redoing the infrastructure in the exclave, so it was probably just a bump on the road. I see. The voices faded away as Florian brought a few of the merchants over to examine the assembled wagons. Leanne rose to her feet and brushed herself off. She went over to the container lot and deactivated her invisibility. After checking her cloak for a wheel track, she went out to join Florian. Oh, customers already, Tilda. Wagner, Florian said, I believe you're already acquainted with Mr. Antalya. It's a pleasure to see you again, Countess Wagner, the merchant offered a bow. Unfortunately, the beastmen took our animals early on, so we won't be drawing any wagons anytime soon. We got you covered, Leanne said. Ruin's Wake will be transporting draft animals for the next few months. That's wonderful. Leto Antalya said, we've been pushing our wagons around by hand recently, and menial labor is getting more and more scarce as people are granted land. I noticed that this is made from some sort of steel. Isn't that a bit much for a simple wagon? Oh, this ain't no simple wagon. Leanne grinned and slapped the nearest front fender. These babies are tested and approved for the Sorceress Kingdom's new transportation system. The container you see loaded there is the most convenient thing you'll ever use. Each wagon is rated for 20 tons. 20 tons? The merchant reached out and tested his weight against the wagon, with just this frame? That's remarkable. Yep, Leanne nodded. The suspension's great, too. You could run over all sorts of things and not notice.